All right. Okay, well, welcome to everybody. As always, if you would be so kind as to turn off your cell phones, that would be greatly appreciated by me, and I'm sure other people in the class. So, today we're going to talk about what I refer to as War in Hell, and that is the battles in New Guinea and the South Pacific. But first of all, I think we need to discuss what is going on in the world at this particular time. So let us assume that it's approximately the middle of the year in 1942. And we need to now look at this as like the big picture. So what's going on worldwide? Well, of course, we saw that Japan goes into this war for two main reasons. The first reason, and I think probably the most important for them, is that they wish to knock China out of the war. So that is their biggest significant goal at this point, is to get China out of that war. And they've got themselves in a situation where, for example, when the U.S. embargoed Japan, the U.S. basically said right before the war, well, look, we'll lift the embargo, but what you need to do is you need to pull out of China, and you need to pull out of the Indochina, or what we call Vietnam today. And the Japanese certainly looked at that proposal because they would basically have gotten, I think we almost promised them most favored nation trading status at that point. The other piece there is that we demanded that they pull out of the Tripartite Pact. So they would in fact become part of, not an ally, but at least out of the war completely as far as World War II goes. And we offered them that deal. They refused that because primarily they have lost 1 million casualties in China. And they feel that they have to give some sort of tangible benefit to the Japanese people for the losses that they've sustained. So that's a big reason why they choose not to pull out and continue and basically take the risk of fighting us in World War II. Big reason there. Well, what's going on with the Chinese at this point? Well, the Chinese, they have the situation where they are now cut off. So they can't get any support from Russia anymore, Soviet Union, because first of all, the Soviets made a pact with the Japanese in early 1941, which cut off aid. And second of all, at this point, the Russians are fighting for their lives against the Germans. So they can't provide any aid. The Japanese at this time control the coastline of Asia all the way from Korea to Burma. So they can't get any supplies there. Remember, the last main road into China for the nationalists to be resupplied by the United States and Britain was through the Burma Road. That's cut. So now the only way that we can supply China and the nationalists is with air power. And that's a trickle compared to what they need. So by this time, the Chinese are in a difficult situation because they're running out of ammunition, money, everything. But yet they continue to fight. They don't surrender. And the Japanese are like, they're not happy about this. And so that causes the Japanese to make a commitment to China that they don't really wish to make at this point. So the largest single concentration of Japanese military power, particularly their army, is still in China by a large amount. The large part of air power. So they can't do everything they want because they're still tied up in China. Well, the nationalists are going to continue to fight. The Japanese are not happy about that, certainly, but they have no choice at this point. So that continues throughout the rest of the war, that there will always be the largest force of Japanese troops will be actually stationed in China. Well, what is their other goal for the Japanese? The other goal is simply that they wanted to take the southern resource area. They thought, and that is predicated really on Germany. So if Germany can defeat Russia, if Germany can defeat Britain, the assumption is that the United States will abandon Asia to the Japanese, and then they will have not only China, but they will also have all the natural resources of Indochina, Java, Borneo, all that oil, tin, rubber, everything they need.
What about Australia?
the Japanese Navy wanted to attack Australia, but
Is that part of their plan?
no, it was never part of the original plan. But we'll get there. So anyway, the bottom line with this is now they've got themselves into the war with the United States in order to take this southern resource area. And again, we have to look at 1942, 80 years ago. And what's going on in Russia? What's going on with the Germans? Well, on May 5th, the Russians launch a major offensive to take the city of Kharkov, or as we know today, Kharkiv. And that offensive starts out relatively successful. They make a 60-mile penetration and get just short of taking Kharkov. What happens next, though, is the Germans launch a counterattack to cut the base of that salient off. And when they do that, they kill or capture 240,000 Russians and destroy 1,000 Russian tanks. Does this sound familiar at all? So, 80 years ago. So, now the Germans are going to launch what they refer to as Case Blue. And Case Blue is going to be their summer offensive of 1942. Their goal is to drive way south into Russia and capture Russia's oil fields. When they capture Russia's oil fields, they feel at that point that they will be able to knock Russia out of the war, and then they can concentrate on Great Britain. So the Japanese, this is what they see. They see that the Germans have destroyed actually two Russian armies. They have made major gains in this new offensive. Of course, we know that on November 18th, which is coming up 80 years ago, the Russians will launch the offensive called Uranus. And the Uranus offensive will be the destruction of the German Sixth Army at a little place called Stalingrad. But the Japanese don't know that yet. They're looking at this going, hey, the Germans are doing good. You know, things are rolling along here. So what is going to be the Japanese plan starting in the middle of 1942? And this is what we're going to look at. We're going to look at this map. So the Japanese plan is to continue to take New Guinea. Remember, they couldn't take New Guinea via sea because of the Battle of Coral Sea, which was basically a tactical victory for the Japanese, but a strategic defeat. So if you look at this map, you can see the black circle is a place called Buna-Gona, and the red circle is a place called Port Moresby. Now, the Japanese don't have the carrier power because of losing at Midway to bring in a naval landing force to take Port Moresby. So they're going to do something else. Instead, they're going to land at Buna-Gona and they're going to march overland. And they're going to attack it that way. If you look at the two yellow circles, that's where the Japanese have major air power. So they have a major base at Rabaul, and they also have a major fighter base at little town of Leh. And Leh is interesting because Leh has probably one of the greatest Japanese naval fighter groups in history. There are four of their top aces of World War II are all based at Leh at this time. There's Ota, there is Lieutenant Sasai, there is Nishizawa, who is the top ace of Japan in World War II, and probably the most famous of all is the man called Saburo Sakai, and Saburo Sakai is particularly famous because he survived the war and wrote a very popular book called Samurai. And those four guys are all based at that little base in Leh. So you can see that that's not far from Buna-Gona. So they have some control of air power over this piece of the Solomon Sea. The last piece is they want to take this purple circle, and that's Milne Bay. And Milne Bay is a nice deep port. It doesn't have a lot of mountains there. The mountain range ends before it gets there. And it's a great place for a base because it'll dominate the Solomon Sea and the Coral Sea. So everybody wants to put a base on Milne Bay. And we'll see how that plays out. So I think it's now important to talk about the terrain. Because when we look at this area of the world, perhaps you've seen the Rodgers and Hammerstein play South Pacific, and there's palm trees and sandy beaches and pretty native girls. And it's really not like that at all. It's really basically, how did I describe it? A miserable, disease-infested jungle, okay? And and you have to forgive me, but I'm going to use the term jungle for triple canopy rainforest. I'm sure I will occasionally not say indigenous people like I should say, and will say natives, so you have my apology up front. Well, neither side wants to fight here. I mean, realistically, they don't want to be here at all. But the fact of the matter is it's all predicated on air power. So what's the point of going here? There's no cities. There's no industry. So let's look at Germany again. So when Germany takes Czechoslovakia, they get the Skoda Armaments Works. And that works begins to crank out tanks and guns for the German army. In 1940, when they capture France, they gain the entire French auto industry, which begins to crank out trucks and vehicles for the Wehrmacht, for the German army. When you attack here, you don't get anything except natural resources. So what are you going to have to do? You're going to have to take those natural resources, you're going to have to put them on a ship, you're going to have to sail it up to Japan, and then you're going to turn that into war material. So what happens, unlike the Germans, as the Japanese continue to expand, they're actually getting further and further away from their production capabilities, and they're actually getting weaker and weaker. So it's really a problem. Now, the people there are basically indigenous hunter-gatherers. I mean, they live in little tiny villages, but they do have an interesting behavior in the fact that they have a taste for a thing called long pig. And if you're unaware of what long pig might be, that would be human flesh. So there's still a significant amount of cannibalism going on at this time in this area. So not a particularly wonderful place to be. Well, again, it consists of triple canopy jungle. The trees are 200 feet high. It's really dark. It's really, really wet. It rains 200 inches a year in these areas. It's a lot of rain. So you're constantly wet. You're constantly living in mud. And this will cause problems with a thing called foot immersion, which this time was referred to as trench foot. And trench foot will actually, your feet will begin to rot, and so much that indeed you can have amputations caused by this problem. So it's not a dry place at all. Well, the Solomon Islands, as we talked a little bit about, are incredibly mountainous. So in the islands themselves on the Solomons, there's peaks as high as 14,000 feet. And that's really high. So when you look at New Guinea, I would ask you to look at this picture. This is a thing called the Kokoda Trail or the Kokoda Track. And the Kokoda Trail is built by the indigenous people, and it's the only way to get over the Owen Stanley mountain range to get from Port Moresby to Buna. There is no road. There's still no road today. So this trail is about 65 miles long. The total distance as a crow flies between those two parts is about 90 miles. But certainly there's no, again, it's a lot longer than 90 miles because you can't just go marching over the mountains. But if you look at this thing, what this actually is a staircase built out of logs that are 18 inches apart. So that's a relatively big step to get up this thing. But again, that's the way that they can do it. So the only way you can get any supplies or anything into this area is on the backs of humans. So everything has to be brought in or out on porters. So it's a very, very difficult area. Now, once we get out of the mountains, we get into a more of a plains area that's covered with a stuff called kunai grass. And kunai grass is about 6 feet tall, and it's razor sharp. So when you're fighting in kunai grass, you literally can't see 2 feet in front of you. When you get a little bit lower and you get towards those nice sandy beaches on Rogers and Hammerstein, then you become involved in tidal basins and basically mangrove swamps. So really, really problematic area to fight in. Well, there are no large predators, believe it or not, in the triple canopy rainforest. There's rats, There's land crabs. Ask anybody that was at Guadalcanal, they'll tell you about that one. There are certainly birds, and there's an incredible amount of insects. So now when you get to those tidal basins, there's another problem, because there is a large predator there. That would be either freshwater or particularly saltwater crocodiles. And it is not uncommon at this time for an unwary bather to become, a crocodile lunch, particularly the salties. They're very, very dangerous. They kill way more people than sharks today. So, okay, it's also hot. It's equatorial. So the temperatures soar over 100 degrees. It's raining a lot, so the humidity is horrible. So now you've got the situation where you've got the temperature index is literally astronomical. So it's a terrible place as far as heat. And when you get up on those top of the mountains, it's still hot, but at night it's freezing cold. So again, a lot of issues here. Well, when you look at this, the combination of high heat and wet soil, you're going to get mosquitoes, and you're going to get mosquitoes in tremendous amounts. And the mosquitoes will carry particularly dengue fever, which is a very, very troublesome sickness, but primarily they will contribute to malaria. Of the troops that fight in this area, 80% will come down with malaria. There's no cure at this time for malaria, but there is ways to suppress it, and that's with the use of quinine, or a German invention that we actually have bought the patent to, the United States, called atabrine. People don't really like atabrine, though. It turns your skin yellow, and the troops believe that it causes sterility, so they're loath to take it. But if they're smart, they will take it, because it doesn't cause sterility, though it does turn your skin yellow. Well, there's another killer here, and that's scrub typhus. And scrub typhus is caused by chiggers. And there's loads of chiggers and there's loads of scrub typhus here, and scrub typhus will kill. Well, you combine all these factors. You're a soldier, you're fighting, you're not eating right, you're not sleeping well, you're not protected, you're heat, rain, disease, all these problems, right? What happens is this land kills. So what will happen, particularly later in the war, but partially in this presentation, is what you want to do is you don't necessarily want to fight your enemy. All you really need to do is have your enemy isolated from supply. If you isolate them from supply, two things will happen. They will starve to death, or they will die of disease. So you need not attack them and kill them. You let the land do it for you. Well, I would look at records from this area for the U.S. Army, best I could find. And they show in 1942 in this area, there were 128,295 treated for disease. 6,438 are treated for psychiatric reasons, and 2,887 are actually treated for wounds. Now, personally, I believe that wound numbers is significantly low, because the kind of injuries that these guys would suffer, we would go to East Alabama Medical Center, okay? But if you look at this hospital, that's a field hospital. It's built on the side of a mountain, okay? So what I think most of these guys would probably do is they'd put a bandage on it or do whatever they could locally and then just keep on going. So I think the numbers for wounded are probably vastly below what they were, but they're still nowhere near 128,295. So keep that in mind. And always in this presentation of this area is that the land is a killer. Well,
water source.
It rains 200 inches. They got plenty of water.
So they collect that and drink.
Well, there's streams, there's rivers, there's all kinds of stuff.
Contamination.
Well, that's a problem, isn't it? Yes.
I had an older cousin that was there in World War II, actually ended up being highly decorated, but said when he first got there, he was afraid he would be shot. And then after a while, he got malaria And then he was afraid he wouldn't be shot.
Right, exactly. It's a horrible place. So look at this. Now, again, I told you the only way in and out of this area on the Kokoda Trail, whichever you prefer, is to carry things on your back. And you can see that the wounded are literally have to be carried out one at a time by porters. So it's just a nasty, nasty place. I mean, I wouldn't recommend it for your next vacation. But you actually can go and take a walk up the track. It's available. They actually have tours where you can, believe it or not, it doesn't appeal much to me, but you can actually take a tour of where you go up the Kokoda track and whatever.
Has it gotten any better in terms of medical care?
Oh, sure. It's like modern times. You can use helicopters now to evacuate people. But at this time, there's only one little airstrip, which I'll talk
What's
about.
the indigenous population now?
I have no idea. I couldn't answer that question, but you can look it up on Google. But anyway, so no modern army is prepared to fight in this battle. The Japanese really aren't prepared. Certainly, we're not prepared. The Australians aren't prepared. Nobody really wants to fight here, like I said. And if you look at this picture, this shows you a little bit something about trying to transport things that are big. So you see this large group of Australian troops trying to tow a British 25-pounder artillery piece through the jungle. A 25-pounder, by the way, fires a 25-pound shell. So you can see that that's not particularly a practical weapon to be using in this terrain. But indeed, they're trying to maneuver this beast through the jungle. Well, the Japanese army, as I've talked a bit about, comes from a relatively poor army. They don't have the ability to build a lot of tanks. They don't have the ability to build a lot of trucks. They don't have a lot of infrastructure to create a typical Western-style modern army. We saw that at the Battle of Khalkhin-Gol in 1939, when the Russians have tanks, the Russians have trucks, and the Russians kick their butt. So the Japanese have to find a way to overcome firepower of Western armies. And what they're going to do is they're going to fight primarily at night, and they're going to fight primarily with light infantry infiltration tactics. They can't stand up to firepower like, against massive artillery and tanks. But what they will try to do is they'll try to get away with avoiding that firepower by fighting these types of tactics. So realistically, like Malaya and we saw in Burma, the Japanese tactics are actually better suited to this type of terrain. Because again, they're a light infantry force with lighter weapons, like we saw that Type 89 knee mortar. So they're better adapted, particularly originally, to this type of fighting. But one thing the Japanese never really seem to understand is they need to support their troops with logistics, regardless of light infantry weapons. And they never seem to figure this out, particularly early in the war. We'll see that again next week. Well, of course, U.S. and Australian forces are structured to fight in civilization. They're structured to have roads, harbors, trains, all the things you need to transport large amounts of logistic goods that they are designed to use in combat. Well, this region is not, as you can see in that picture, this region is not really adaptable to that. But as time goes on, both armies will begin to adapt and adapt quite well. So, but really a tough situation to fight this kind of battle with our typical tactics. Well, and I would direct you to this picture. This is a Japanese 70mm gun. Now, indeed, that looks like a toy cannon, but it's still a cannon. And I guarantee you, it's a lot easier to drag that thing through the jungle than it is to drag that 25-pounder. So it's not nearly as effective as a weapon would it be in major combat, but indeed, in these conditions, that is a good weapon to have. And that's what the Japanese, again, that demonstrates how they're built differently.
Would they disassemble that and move it?
Yes, you can carry it. They would backpack that, basically. So I can't remember the total number of crew. It's a crew-served weapon, of course, but I can't remember the total number of crew, but they would just basically disassemble it and lug it. And then the soldiers, would generally carry one artillery shell each. So basically you had your regular combat load, the infantrymen would have accompanied it, and they'd each carry an artillery shell on top of that. So that's how they would transport this stuff through the jungle. And again, it doesn't fire nearly as heavy a shell as the British 25-pounder. So much more portable. Well, again, the fighting here is going to become pretty much different than what everybody really expected at this time. And first of all, you're in this triple canopy jungle or you're in kunai grass and you can't see anything. So literally, if you're on the attack and the enemy is dug into this area, you don't see them until basically they open fire on you or you basically blunder into them. The other piece is if you've got two patrols in this area, those two patrols will frequently have meeting engagements because, again, they can't see each other until they're right on top of each other. And then they'll turn into these terrible, bloody, little violent fights. And it's literally point blank range fighting at this time. And it's almost impossible to surround your enemy because your enemy can melt into what I refer to as the green fog. So they can basically just disperse into the jungle. And it's hard to capture a lot of troops, but these fights are literally, like I said, point blank range. You bump into somebody and it's like, bam. It's an aggressive fighting. And I'll go to a book that I highly recommend if you're interested in this topic. It's called Touched with Fire by Bergerud. And Bergerud says this: although the struggle in the South Pacific contained elements of modern warfare, its essence more closely resembled a knife fight out of the Stone Age. So, very, very difficult place to be fighting in. Well, I would point this out too, and in Vietnam these were commonly used as well, and that's the banyan tree. And the banyan tree, what you would do is you would dig underneath it, and then you would use that like a little fort. So you're virtually invisible when you're inside this thing. And you'll see that fighting changes. The Japanese will basically control the night, and the Australians and the U.S. troops will control the daytime. So it's a very, very different kind of fighting than either group was really planning on. And so if you're an Australian or a U.S. troop and you're fighting and you're in a foxhole, you don't get out of that foxhole at nighttime at all. You stay in that foxhole until it becomes daylight. Part of the reason is you're afraid to be killed by your own men. And the second reason is the Japanese are using infiltration tactics. So they're basically crawling along the ground looking to kill you in your foxhole. So if you hear something that you believe is the Japanese, what you're going to do is you're going to pop a grenade and just kind of pitch that out. And hopefully that will either kill the Japanese or at least deter them. The last thing you want to do is to fire your rifle, because if you fire your rifle, that will create a flash and then they know exactly where you are. And then you're liable to get a grenade in your pit. So you see that it's really a very, very different kind of fighting. The Allies only attack in daytime. Japanese virtually only attack at night. Well, that brings up air support. Well, if you're in a triple canopy jungle, it's mighty darn difficult for somebody flying above you to see where your lines are and where the enemy lines are. So the use of basically ground support aircraft is relatively non-existent in these battles. That's not to say that air power isn't important, because air power is incredibly important, because what it will do, it will isolate your enemy, keep them from getting supply ships, and keep them from getting food and medicine that they need to stay alive. And indeed, then the land will help you kill them. So, different use of air power. You don't see it used, again, to attack like trench lines. That's just not going to happen. Same thing, of course, goes to artillery. Artillery is, particularly early in the war we're talking about today, was extremely, extremely limited. Just by the fact you can't move it around, and it's such a large logistics task to bring in tons of ammunition to feed those guns. So again, you'll see this as being primarily, like I said, an infantry war. So what will be the key weapon? The key weapon will actually be rifles and light weapons. And so let's take a little minute to talk about the key weapons at this particular time. Well, this is the M1 Garand. It is the standard infantry rifle of the United States Army, and it will become the standard weapon of the United States Marines eventually, not right away. It's a semi-automatic weapon. It's gas operated. It fires a 8 rounds, as you can see in these little zip clips. So there's a box magazine, or excuse me, an internal box magazine. You pop that clip in, and then you've got 8 shots, and you can shoot as fast as you can pull a trigger. Bang, 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 bang. Okay? Much, much more handy in close-in fighting, because you can fire as fast as you can pull that trigger and then pop in another load and keep shooting. So you can get a lot of rounds off quickly with this. It's not particularly light, but it's not stupid heavy. It's just probably the best rifle for these conditions. I would say for a rifle. We'll continue, but keep in mind the Garand is semi-automatic. That's a huge advantage. Now we'll talk about the Arisaka. There are 2 versions of this rifle. I'm going to talk about the early version here, which was more common at this time in the war. The Arisaka is a bolt-action rifle with a 5-round internal magazine. So basically, now if I'm going to use this weapon, bang, bang, I got 5 shots, then I got to reload it. So it's much, much slower to fire this weapon in combat. It's a problem, but it's got other issues too. It's a 6.5 millimeter bullet, which is a very, very light bullet compared to our 7.7 millimeter approximately that we use in the Garand and the British Enfield rifle. So in order to get the muzzle velocity much higher to propel that little light bullet a long way, because remember, this isn't just made to fight in the jungle, it's made to fight at typical military ranges, which were probably about 500 yards at that time. It turns to be shorter as the world goes on, but anyway, you will see that they wanted that range. So in order to propel that bullet, they need to make this barrel really long. Well, I'm a Japanese infantryman. I'm not particularly tall. Well, I'm not particularly tall anyway, but the fact is, this thing is over 4 feet long. And I put a bayonet on it, and it's probably taller than the soldier that's carrying it. So it's not a particularly, it's a little cumbersome, let's put it that way, to be trucking around in the jungle with this thing and swinging it around, because it's really long and it's not particularly heavy, but it actually has some advantages. This gun is incredibly reliable. It can be dirty, it can be rusty, it can be a mess, and it'll still operate. So it's not a finicky weapon at all. The other thing it has is the Japanese have developed a powder that's vastly superior to ours. The Japanese have developed a propellant of gunpowder, well, not gunpowder, but a propellant that is smokeless. So if I fire this gun from underneath a banyan tree, you don't see any smoke, and it's hard to know where I am. Also, this gun has a very, very low muzzle flash. So it doesn't, at nighttime, it doesn't create a large flash to see where it's being fired from. So a couple of advantages there. Now, when I look at the M1 Garand, our troops actually refer to the M1 as Old Smoky. Okay, because our powder is pretty smoky. And so basically you kind of give your position away with our powder compared to the Japanese. So they really have an advantage here in that regard. But again, very, very limited firepower with this 5 shots and a bolt action. Well, the British gun is the Lee Enfield Mark I Type 3, I believe. The long title. And this gun actually dates back to World War I. But it's a highly successful weapon. It's got a 10-round box magazine, so you can pop them in and out instead of using a zip clip. It has got a very smooth action. It's not particularly heavy. Again, it's still a bolt-action rifle, but you have 10 shots. So it's way better than the Japanese in that regard. So many people feel that this was the best bolt-action rifle of World War I and World War II. Some people feel that the Mauser was better. I am not here to tell you which one is better. You would have to make that decision on your own. But again, it was an incredibly popular gun. So much so that the Australian Army used this same weapon in Korea, and I believe they used it up until about 1960. So this gun had an incredibly long lifespan. So a pretty good weapon, not as good as the Garand, I would say, but certainly something useful. Now, it's time for me to talk about the weapon that if I was fighting in this terrain, I would want. And that is the Thompson submachine gun. Or you might call it the Tommy gun or a Tommy. Okay. Now this gun can fire 600 rounds a minute. You know, and if I'm in a tough spot in a bunch of kunai grass, I think spraying a lot of bullets is probably to my advantage. Well, it fires a pistol round. It doesn't fire a rifle round. It fires a 45 caliber ACP pistol round, the same one that's used in our M1911 handgun. So, not as big a bullet, but it's a really heavy bullet. It doesn't have a lot of range because it's a pistol round. So its effective range, some people say 50, some people say 100 yards. Regardless, if you get hit with this thing, you know you've been hit with something because it's a big, heavy chunk of lead. So it'll knock you down. So again, it fires really fast. It has a lot of hitting power. Great weapon for that regard. A problem with it is it's really heavy. It weighs 13 or 14 pounds. It's finicky. It needs to be maintained very, very properly. It needs to be cleaned. It doesn't work well if it's rusty. It's got that issue. The other issue it has at this time, and part of the reasons that the Australians love this gun and the United States Marine Corps didn't really love it was because it was a problem to maintain it. But at this time, the Australians are using this version, which has this large drum magazine. That drum magazine is really difficult to reload. So it's a clockwork. So you put a bullet in, you turn it, and you're tightening a spring as you're putting bullet in, bullet in, bullet in, right? There's two versions. There's a 50 bullet magazine and there's a 100 drum. But it's really slow to reload this. So if you don't have a spare drum on you to fire, if you're in a combat situation, you want to probably be a little cautious with spreading too much ammunition because you're going to have a trouble reloading this thing. One other problem with this drum magazine that's replaced again by later in the war, you'll see more common versions of this gun with a 20 or a 30 round box magazine. This thing is heavy because of that big drum, and it's a little bit less structure than it probably should have had. So occasionally, if you're in a firefight and you swing it around or you bump it into something, that drum falls off. That's probably not a good thing to happen when you're in the middle of a firefight. So, but again, of all these weapons, the one that I would have would be that one. That would be my choice. So at this point, why don't we take a, oh no, wait a minute, I'm not there yet. Sorry. This is basically Australian Army, and we need to talk about that a little bit first. I would again have you look at this picture. And you'll see here two Australian soldiers carrying Lee Enfields, and the one far on the right holding it like that is probably carrying a Tommy. And that's a really good grouping to have. You want a couple of riflemen, and always you want somebody with a Tommy when you're trucking around in the jungle. You can see that they're not wearing shirts. They're not wearing pants. They're walking in knee-deep or ankle-deep mud there. And, of course, they're going to be getting a lot of mosquito bites and chiggers. So you can see they're not well protected with clothing that they're wearing here. Well, there's two types of units in the Australian Army. There's the Australian militia, which is similar to what we would see as our National Guard. Difference is that militia troops are drafted. They're raised locally. So much like our National Guard, they're you know, you have a state National Guard like Alabama National Guard. So the same issue is these are locally raised troops. The key with them being drafted, though, and being in the militia is they can only fight in Australia or Australian possessions. They are not to fight anywhere else in the world except those two places. And like most National Guards at this time, they're not as particularly well trained. They're not particularly well led. And I would say that frequently, and we'll see this in the U.S. Army at this time as well, their officers, some of their officers will come from the professional army, but some of them will be local prominent citizens. And that's always a problem because these aren't professional soldiers. So perhaps you've got the, some politician is, becomes a colonel, or you have a local lawyer that's, is a captain, and they're not trained military professionals. So it's always a bit of a problem with leadership. The best leadership will come from what we refer to as the AIF, and that's the Australian Imperial Force. These are professional soldiers. They are volunteers. They can fight anywhere in the world at the behest of the Australian government and the British Empire. So it's not like the British Empire controls them, but if the Australian government allows it, they can fight on behalf of the British anywhere in the world. So that is their professional army. Much better trained, much better armed, just a lot better troops generally. But again, they've been trained to fight, and particularly they're fighting in North Africa. And they fight very well in North Africa. For example, the first Battle of Tobruk, the Australians hold the city of Tobruk until they're relieved several months, I believe, later. So these are really good troops. But when the Japanese are getting closer to Australia, Prime Minister Curtin, the Prime Minister of Australia, demands his units back. I need my divisions back. They need to come back and defend their homeland. Well, that's a problem for the British because the British need them in North Africa. And also, one of these units has already been destroyed. There were 4 originally. And that one that we talked about was the 8th Division, which was destroyed at Singapore, Timor, and Rabaul. Remember, it had been spread out. So the deal is cut because the British are like, okay, you can have 2 of your divisions right now, but we need at least one of these kept behind. We can't do without them in North Africa at this point, fighting the Germans. And a decision is made between Churchill and basically FDR that what the United States is going to do is they're going to send Australia 3 U.S. divisions if they will leave 1 division in North Africa, which is a pretty good deal because they're going to get 3 for 1. And indeed, Curtin agrees to this. It also causes a political change, because now the Australians begin to look vastly more at the United States for security than they do for Great Britain. So we see that dynamic has changed in the Pacific, where now the Australians are much more concerned about what the U.S. is doing than what the British are doing. So again, they get their divisions. Oh, picture. That's kunai grass. Looks like a lot of fun fighting in that, huh? Gee, I wonder where the enemy is.
Is that an Enfield?
That's an Enfield. So, again, they're highly trained, they're highly motivated, and now they're fighting for their own country. They're not fighting in North Africa anymore, fighting the Germans. They're fighting the Japanese to defend Australia. And they are going to be really, really good about this. The other piece is they know that the Japanese have been terrible to their prisoners of war from the 8th AIF unit and have treated the civilians in these areas terribly as well. So they are not exactly, the Japanese, let's put it this way, aren't particularly popular with the Australians at this particular time. Anything but. So again, highly motivated troops. Well, as the war goes on, it's said this, and this is tried to be a little bit of humor, and simply that in New Guinea, eventually the Australians become the best jungle fighters, that indeed the Japanese are the second best jungle fighters, and of course the United States, nobody knows, because by the time we develop the logistics capability that we will have near the end of the war, that we just blow the jungle up and knock it down. So again, it's just a difference of how logistics is structured in this area. We have vastly more capability logistics-wise than any other country in the world, particularly the Japanese. And now we should take a break. Now I want to talk about what I refer to as the Japanese cult of death. That's a fun topic. Well, so as we see World War II in Asia and other places, of course, too, but we see that the brutality is incredibly high. And I think the biggest part of this is because, particularly in these battles, is that the Japanese absolutely refuse to surrender. And certainly refusal to surrender causes numerous problems, but we'll go into this in detail. But Burgerud will refer to this as a war without mercy. And you see in this picture, that's Imperial Japanese Army troops executing prisoners. It's interesting you would take pictures of that. Well, modern scholars have tied this to racism, so that the Japanese didn't like Caucasians, the Caucasians didn't like Asians, and certainly I don't deny that's piece. I certainly think that's a factor. But I don't think that's the largest factor. I think there's something much more, as far as the Japanese go, is when we go back in time to the Meiji Restoration, when Japan begins to modernize under the Meiji Emperor. There's no longer the Tokugawa shogunate. Those of you who remember my other class probably can relate to this. He starts to issue, Meiji issues imperial rescripts. And one of the imperial rescripts is that all Japanese will be educated. And all Japanese also will say the Japanese version of the Pledge of Allegiance. So they will pledge fealty to the emperor, and they will also pledge to defend the Japanese homeland to the death. And the Japanese military also receives another imperial rescript where they are told that they can never surrender. And they are to recite this every day. So every Japanese soldier, naval, whatever, every day they recite this imperial rescript to the letter. And Burgerud would say, death in battle was portrayed as an honor to the family and a transcendent act on the part of the individual. Surrender was a disgrace to the soldier and his family. So that transcendent act is that you, in effect, will become part of the kami. Not a full god, but there as perpetual spirit to defend Japan for eternity. So you will be a soldier of Japan forever in the afterlife. And you will meet at a place called the Yasukuni Shrine, which still exists today. So it is very important that you never surrender and you die in battle. Well, yeah, not a pretty picture. The Japanese had several other issues. Unlike most modern armies, it was completely common for Japanese leadership to brutalize their subordinates. So they would be slapped, kicked, beaten, even hit with clubs. Even for minor things as if you misspoke doing that, basically that imperial rescript on the military every day. You made a mistake saying that, you were going to get hit. And we see this, the whole thought process of the Japanese. Part of that rescript is a song that they had created. It's not actually part of the script, but it's a part of that thinking is that the song said that death is as light as a feather and duty is as heavy as a mountain. So once again, you were expected to follow orders. You were to obey. That's why they would beat you. So you would positively, absolutely obey orders. Well, the Japanese will also do another thing that's uncommon for most militaries, is that they will accept orders that mean certain death. So we see this, of course, in kamikazes. We would also see this in the Japanese army, where it would be said to a soldier, I want you as officer come up to him, I want you to go dig a hole in that road. And I want you to get in that hole and cover yourself up, and you're going to have a bomb with you. And when a U.S. tank rolls over that hole, you're going to detonate that bomb. And you're going to blow up that tank. And Japanese soldiers would accept these orders. Not a common order in the United States. You might ask to volunteer to do something suicidal, but they would literally be ordered to do it and accept those orders. So another key part is then honorable surrender. So when we talk about honorable surrender, this goes back many, many years. And simply enough is that if I am cut off or I no longer have the capacity to realistically defend myself, and I'm in a particularly a large unit, make that distinction. Okay, it's usually large units, because individual surrender is always problematic no matter where you are. So, but if I'm in a relatively large unit and I decide I can no longer fight, it is completely acceptable to surrender. And that limits casualties on both sides. Of course, the people that surrender, their casualties are limited, and the people that would eventually have to go in and kill them all, their casualties are limited as well. It makes war much less costly. Well, the Japanese, of course, are not going to surrender. They have an order. They cannot. By imperial rescript, there is no surrender allowed. So even wounded Japanese must die. So it's totally common for if I'm a wounded Japanese soldier and I have a grenade, and I will lay there and I will hold that grenade. And if an Allied medic comes up to me to take care of me, when he does that, I will pull that pin on that grenade and hope that, first of all, I will kill myself and take that enemy medic with me. You can see where this is spiraling out of control. So if I'm a medic and I can't get trust that I can take care of a wounded Japanese soldier, what am I going to do? I'm just going to shoot him. I'm not going to try to take the chance that I'm going to be able to take care of this Japanese soldier. I'm going to just shoot him because I can't trust them to not do something to me. Well, so the war in the Pacific is going to become a battle basically of annihilation. And Japanese units, when they basically have reached a point where they can no longer fight in an organized manner, they will do something that we refer to as a Banzai charge. The Banzai charge is designed to do two things. It's designed to make sure that that everybody is killed in that unit and that they take as many Allied troops with them as possible. The Japanese never refer to it as a Banzai charge. They refer to it as a Gyakusai. Gyakusai means shattered jewel. So that unit is a jewel, and that jewel is destroyed before it will surrender. So that's their thinking on what that actually means. Well, and I will use an AIF infantryman. His name is Bill Crooks, and he says this real plainly, I would say. We knew their Bushido Banzai code was to take no prisoners in battle and never surrender, so we killed them. Again, a war of annihilation. No prisoners, no wounded, just death. Well, it is now time to talk about what the Japanese plans were actually going to be to capture New Guinea. And the idea is if they can capture New Guinea, they can begin to isolate Australia. They isolate Australia, and the Germans continue advancing in Russia, and perhaps they can knock the U.S. out of the war, and particularly the Australians out of the war. So, again, the idea here is to keep expanding the empire and make sure that no supplies can get from the United States to Australia, and that is primarily going to be due to air power. So they want to capture Milne Bay. It's a really nice deep harbor. It can support a really large airfield. As you see, it dominates the Solomon Sea and the Coral Sea from the Australian coast. So it's an incredibly strategic place to be. And another thing is the U.S. and MacArthur want to create a bomber base there. And the reason they want to put a bomber base there is they have a bomber base at Port Moresby. But if I'm at Port Moresby, what I have to do is I have to climb over the Owen Stanley Mountains and then go on to attack places like Rabaul. Well, that wastes a lot of fuel. So that ability to, remember, I got a full load of bombs, I got a full load of gas, and I'm now going to have to climb over these mountains and then make my attack. So if I can build a bomber base at Milne Bay, I don't have to fly over the mountains, and I can save a lot of fuel. And I can carry more bombs, depending. So it's a very, very strategic location, and of course, everybody wants it. Well, by June of 42, they send an Australian militia force, not AIF, and a group of U.S. engineers. They're going to build airfields and a coastal artillery battle to Milne Bay. Because, again, they want to build 3 airfields. Well, one of those airfields, the fighter strip, becomes operational on July 22nd. And the Royal Australian Air Force, the RAAF, will put a squadron of P-40 fighters on that little strip they've just built. That's going to be a huge problem for the Japanese, as we'll see in this presentation. Well, the Japanese, they don't really want to capture Milne Bay. They actually want to capture an island that dominates the entrance to that, and that's where they're going to build their air base. But they use reconnaissance, and they see that the Australians are now building an air base there. And they decide, well, we can't let that happen. We have to go capture that air base. So now the plan is to invade into Milne Bay itself, which is a difference. The Japanese are going to vastly underestimate what they're going to need to make this attack. They think it's lightly defended. And they're going to use a thing called the Special Naval Landing Force, that is basically Japanese Marines, that are going to be 2,000 of them. They're going to make this invasion, and they're going to bring 2 tanks in as well. Well, the Australians, of course, because we have great code breaking capability, know that the Japanese are coming, and they begin to vastly reinforce this area, particularly with veterans from that 2nd AIF division. So now there's 8,000 Australian and U.S. troops at Milne Bay, and the Japanese are going to land 2,002 tanks. It's probably not a good number. Well, but the Japanese have a plan to do something different. They're not going to just land forces in the bay. They're going to land at Taupota and march overland. And we'll see that on the next map. And they're going to take the Milne Bay defenders from the rear. So if you look at the lower picture here, you can see Taupota, and I've made a red arrow showing how they're going to land there and then come in from behind. And also they're going to land in the bay. So they're going to try to create a pincer movement. Well, this gets off to a bad start right away because the Japanese land that force that's going to land at Taupota, and they are going to be on this place called Goodenough Island. And they're getting organized on Goodenough Island to launch the assault via barge on that place to make that surprise attack in the rear. Well, the P-40 see that. And they go in there and they basically destroy all their barges and almost all their supplies. And so that unit for the Japanese is actually stranded on Goodenough Island for a couple of months. So they're completely out of the battle. Well, if you look at the the upper picture, the Japanese are going to land on the night of August 25th. They have to come in at night. Keep that in mind. The daytime belongs to Allied air power. So they have to come in at night. But if you look at the upper map, you can see that they land 2 miles short of their intended landing beaches. So if it doesn't seem like 2 miles is such a big deal. But when you're trying to trek through a mangrove swamp, that's a big deal. It's hard to advance, but they do advance pretty well, and they run into one of those Australian militia units, and they basically rout them. The Japanese Marines are actually quite good soldiers. And so they're making some progress here. Well, the next morning, on the 26th, once again, those P-40s see the Japanese supplies on the beach in Milne Bay, and they see Japanese barges, and the Japanese haven't been able to disperse this stuff inland, and they destroy a lot of the Japanese ammunition and food. So now the Japanese are low on food and ammunition. So things aren't going particularly well for this invasion, but they've got those 2 tanks. And the Australians don't have any tanks. So those 2 tanks are getting, the Japanese are getting some traction here, really, surprisingly enough, against such a large force. But both of those tanks, as you can see in this picture, get stuck in the mud and they are abandoned. So now the Japanese are really in a tough situation. Again, they're outnumbered. They don't have a lot of food. They don't have a lot of ammunition. And the Japanese Navy is trying to resupply them, but they can only come in at night. And finally, they're starting to take a lot of casualties and they can't get resupplied properly. And the decision is made for the Japanese to withdraw from Milne Bay. And they do so on September 5th. Well, believe it or not, this is the first time that a Japanese invasion, not like Wake Island where they didn't actually land, but a Japanese invasion is actually defeated by U.S. and Australian troops in the war. And you can think about that. They've managed to do it basically almost for a year and never really have this type of defeat. So the Japanese army has done quite well for up to this time, but they now have to abandon this campaign, so they can no longer advance to Milne Bay. So they've lost this one. Well, that brings us to the main event in New Guinea, and that is the Kokoda Trail campaign. And we talked a little bit about this at the beginning of the presentation, but you can see at the top of the picture, the Japanese are going to land at Buna-Gona, up in the top in the north. And they're going to march down that trail and take Port Moresby from the land side because they have enough air power, like I talked about at Rabaul and Ley, to maintain this beachhead. It's not that it's not contested, it certainly is, but indeed they have enough air power. They don't have the air power. Remember, Kido Butai is destroyed, and they don't have the air power now to bring a carrier force into the to attack Port Moresby from the sea. So again, this is the best plan they could come up with. Well, again, there's some major issues with their thinking in this regard. First of all, the Japanese believe there's a road that leads from Buna-Gona to Port Moresby. Well, of course, there isn't. The only thing that's there is the Kokoda Trail. So, and they bring in a bunch of construction troops to help fortify this road. Well, there's no road. But they also are smart enough to bring in a bunch of native porters from Rabaul because they still know that they're going to need people to carry things on their back in this tough terrain. And so indeed they do that. Well, what's going on at the same time is that Buna-Gona is only lightly defended. There's only 4 platoons. That's a very, very small force of militia troops defending this whole area. But MacArthur wants to capture this area too. So what he has done, he has sent 2 units of the Australian militia, the 30th and the 39th, up the trail to try to take, before the Japanese are there, they're already on their way, to reinforce this area and basically keep it from falling into Japanese hands. Well, because he wants to build an air base there and then attack Rabaul from there as well. So it's really not a good place for an air base, but we'll get there. Yes.
Those native porters that they brought in,
Yes.
they were not volunteers. Is that slave labor?
I would say that's probably about 85% accurate.
What's the other 15%?
Probably thought the Japanese were cool. There are some of the indigenous people here, not the majority by any means. The vast majority hate the Japanese, and eventually their behavior at Rabaul particularly becomes so bad that the people in Rabaul, the indigenous population, hate the Japanese. You'll see the same thing at Guadalcanal. But there early on, there are some people that think, you know, I'm not too fond of white people either, so maybe I like the Japanese better. So that's kind of the idea there. Well, anyway, so the Japanese are going to land at Buna-Gona. There's not much opposition, and the MacArthur is trying to rush troops from Port Moresby northward to get to Buna-Gona, but he's too late. So the Japanese land on July 21st. And I said that Australian, that's the group that's in the lead, the 39th Brigade. There's also the 30th. They are not able to reach there in time. Well, the force that the Japanese land is called the South Sea Force. It's under a General Hori, and I think he's actually rather a pretty good general. So Hori doesn't take time to consolidate. Once they brush that little 4 platoons of militia out of their way, he says, we're going, and he hasn't landed all his forces yet either. He says, we're going hell-bent up that trail. And indeed, they begin to make an incredible amount of gain. If you'll see in just a couple of days, they have marched up all the way to where that red circle is. And they also begin a meeting engagement with that 39th Brigade of the Australian militia, and they basically rout him. And they kill the leader of that unit. So that unit now has to retreat all the way to Daniki. And you can see Daniki is in that red circle, just below Kokoda. Well, now the Japanese by the 29th have control of Kokoda. And this is a big deal, really, if the Japanese would have thought about it better. Because at Kokoda, there's a small airstrip. If they could use that airstrip to resupply, remember, everything coming from Buna is being carried in on the backs of people. The Japanese never decide to use that airstrip to bring in supplies. Certainly a huge mistake on their part. Well, South Sea Force basically halts at Kokoda. They bring in more troops. Hori now has a force of 6,000 men, and he's decided now he's going to make an effort to capture Port Moresby because he's ready to make this attack. And they begin moving up the trail, and there's a bunch of meeting battles between the 30th and the 39th brigades. And of course, they're trying to bring in 2 brigades of the 7th AIF. Those are the professional soldiers, the Australian Imperial Force. So they continue to fight, and the Japanese are continuing to advance, and they push them back to a place called, like you can see in that map, Templeton's Crossing. So they capture Issaroa. They continue to drive these people ahead, and they finally have pushed them back. And they're going to be now a major engagement between the Australian Imperial Force and the Japanese South Sea Force. And that's going to be at this place called Mission Ridge. So please pay careful attention to this map, and because we need to see what's going on here. So the Australian Imperial Force at this point has 1,400 men. They're going to be opposed by 1,520 Japanese. So that's certainly not a large superiority of Japanese force since they're on the attack. But what they're going to do is they're going to use the same tactics they have been using in Malaya, in Burma, etc. Is they're going to attack head-on to fix the Australians in position, and then they are going to try to sneak a force, and you can see that in that red arrow that goes along the river there. They're going to try to sneak a force to get in behind those people and get on that trail. And indeed, that's not such bad territory because they're going along that river. It's easier to move troops than it would be to move people through the jungle. So it's actually a good plan. They also have 6 of those little artillery pieces I showed you, those 70-millimeter guns. The Australians have no artillery. So indeed, they have a slight advantage in that regard too, because they have these light artillery pieces. Again, they don't have a lot of ammunition, but indeed they have some. So a key feature here, and to Jim's point, is there's a Papuan native that is willing to side with the Japanese and lead them through the jungle to get in behind the Australians and get back on the trail. And indeed, that person does that. So now you can see in the map that 3 of the units are cut off, and 1 is basically on the good side of the trail. Well, there's a communications breakdown, and that unit that's on the good side of the trail, that's not surrounded, withdraws without launching an assault on the Japanese. So now what we see is 3 of those Australian units are surrounded. They can't break through the Japanese line. And now what they have to do, same thing as we saw in Malaya and Burma, is they have to abandon their equipment and go into the bush. You can see that in the blue arrow going towards the bottom of the picture. So the one unit goes down the trail, the other three have to escape into the jungle, basically. Well, this is a huge victory for the Japanese because first of all, they've beaten an AIF force, but they don't realize what they've actually accomplished. There's really nothing between them right now in Port Moresby. There is no strong organized force of Australians that can defend Port Moresby. So if the Japanese would advance rapidly, there is certainly the possibility, I would question that they would actually capture Port Moresby, but they'd certainly get to Port Moresby, but they don't advance rapidly. And the Australians bring in more forces, and they are going to station them at a place called Imita Ridge. And you can see Imita Ridge in this picture. So the Japanese have beaten the AIF. That's a big deal. So much so that the brigadier in charge of that unit, his name was Potts, he's sacked. He's out of there. And again, now the Japanese are really close to Port Moresby. But that's a problem in the fact that realistically, the Japanese supply line is now this big, long thing. Remember, as a crow flies, that's 90 miles across, but it's certainly not that. And plus, they have to bring things in over the trail. So the Japanese are basically at the very end of their supply line, but the Australians are right by Port Moresby. So it's easy for them to bring in troops to defend Imita Ridge particularly. So we see now that the Australians are in a much, much stronger position than they would have been. The Japanese are in a very weak position. Well, another big problem with the Japanese is that at this point, we have invaded Guadalcanal. And the Japanese now have to make a decision. Do they reinforce Hori, or do they try to retake Guadalcanal? They don't really have the capability to do both. For example, those fighter pilots that are at Leh, they are all transferred to Rabaul so they can fight against Guadalcanal. So the decision by the Japanese is that they will make their major effort to destroy the U.S. Marines on Guadalcanal, which we will talk about next week. And indeed, they're going to leave Hori out on his own. And then finally, because his supply line is so tenuous, he is allowed to withdraw back to Buna-Gona, and they withdraw on September 26th. So this is the last attempt the Japanese will make in order to capture Port Moresby. So Port Moresby from this point in the war is completely safe. So again, Guadalcanal plays a huge part in what's going on in New Guinea. Well, now there's going to be a fight for Buna-Gona. And Buna-Gona it's one of those tidal basin mangrove swamp areas. And you can see this picture of Buna-Gona here. This is how you can traverse Buna-Gona. You build little bridges. So it's really a nasty place. And of course, there's the usual crocodiles, insects, etc. So that's where we're going to be fighting now. Well, MacArthur is under the impression that Buna-Gona is lightly defended, and he knows that Hori has been defeated. So he basically sends in his Sutherland, is like his intelligence guy, and he says, there's really nothing there. The Japanese only have hasty field emplacements, so this should be basically a cakewalk. We should be able to easily take this Buna-Gona area and get the Japanese out of here. Well, I talked about those Japanese engineers. They haven't exactly been idle all this time building a road because there's no road to build. So they've been building fortifications. And indeed, this is some really good fortifications in a very tough place. So the idea is the Australian 7th Division, the Australian Imperial Force Division, the good guys, they're going to go over the trail and attack Buna-Gona from the south. And then what the United States is going to do is they're going to land the 32nd Division by Buna, and that division will then put the Japanese in a pincer movement. Well, problem with that is is that the 32nd Division isn't particularly well prepared to fight in this area. It's a National Guard unit. It's not as well trained as it probably should have been. It's certainly not officered as well as it should have been. And they're certainly not trained to fight in this type of a jungle swamp. Again, you can see this picture is that's an Australian trench. And what they have to do is they have to put tree limbs across it to keep themselves out of the water. So it's wet. Well, 32nd Division is going to land by sea. But again, this is mid-1942, and it's not like we have a bunch of LSTs and landing craft like we would have in perhaps D-Day years later. So there's also a lot of coral reefs, and it's shallow water. So the idea is they're going to land an entire U.S. infantry division using coastal freighters and fishing boats. Well, coastal freighters and fishing boats can't carry artillery. They can't carry tanks. They can't carry a lot of stuff that these guys need. So now they're going to be basically just an infantry force landing on this Buna. And the Japanese, it's not like they don't have any air power. They still do, and they begin to sink these little coastal freighters and these fishing boats. So they lose a lot of their ammunition, but most importantly is that a ship that was carrying virtually all their medicine is destroyed. So now they're landed in this area with no atabrine and no quinine. Huge problem for them. Well, they launch numerous attacks, do the best they can, but the Japanese basically blunt them every time. And the reason is pretty simple, is what the Japanese have done in this area is there's little high ground. And where there is high ground, they've built fortifications. And these fortifications are made out of coconut logs. What do you think? Well, it's a coconut log. Coconut logs are surprisingly good stopping firepower because they're very fibrous. So they build these blockhouses up on what little high ground there is, and then they cover them with dirt, and then they let plants grow on them. So they're hard to see because they're covered with vegetation. So again, you have this problem of these fortifications, but the best way to handle fortifications is to get behind them. Can't do that because you're in a tidal swamp, and you can't get behind something or attack it very easily when you're in knee-deep or waist-deep water. First of all, there's no place to lay down and hide. Second of all, you can't run. So now you're forced to have continual frontal attacks on these fixed positions. And this is not going well at all. Well, MacArthur, he's impatient. He's like, come on, you guys should be able to beat these Japanese. That's no problem. And he sends in the Corps commander, actually, that he has, and that's Eichelberger. And Eichelberger looks at what's going on and says, well, you know what? All you National Guard officers just aren't any good. And he fires the division commander, the 3 regimental commanders, and all the battalion commanders. They're all sacked and sent back to the United States. So, but he also realizes that they got a huge logistics problem because they don't have the capability to get logistics in here like they should, because they were using little coastal freighters and fishing boats. And so what are they going to do? They don't have an airfield yet. So they're going to drop supplies in, but they don't have parachutes. So what are they going to do? They're going to wrap this stuff in blankets. They're going to fly over the U.S. lines, and they're going to dump it out. Okay. So, I mean, if it wasn't sad, it would be comical. Okay. Because needless to say, a lot of this stuff doesn't survive the impact. And it's so incredibly wasteful that you would never see probably any other army. Maybe the Germans would do something like this, but it's amazing to me that you would even try this. But indeed we did, and it didn't work out particularly well. But the battle becomes basically a stalemate at this point. But the Allied logistics are getting better and better, and the Japanese logistics are getting worse and worse. So the Japanese are now running out of food, running out of medicine, running out of ammunition. The Japanese do manage to slip a couple of destroyers in, because destroyers, you'll see this at Guadalcanal too. They'll rush the destroyers in at night before our air power can get them, and then they'll do what they got to do and then get out of Dodge as fast as they can and get out of range of air power. So they actually do manage to pull 1,200 troops out of there, mostly sick and wounded. Well, the Australians finally get some barges and bring in 13 tanks and artillery. So now these Japanese fixed blockhouse things that are on high ground are now subject to tank fire, and they start to knock them out one by one. And again, the Japanese are starving to death at this point. Remember, I always tell you that land kills. So they try to get 1,000 to 1,900 of them try to just escape overland and get back to Leh and Salamaua, which are still in Japanese hands, of course. Well, some of them do get through the jungle and get back to Leh and Salamaua. Some of them, of course, end up as the blue plate special for the indigenous population. So, but the Japanese actually are the people that remain, the rear guard that are holding off the Australians and the U.S. forces. They basically are now in a terrible situation. They're starving to death. They're sick. And they actually start to eat their own dead in order to survive and continue fighting. So again, the Japanese won't surrender. So they actually start to resort to cannibalism. But they're still hanging out. So finally, by January 22nd of 1943, this battle is over. And we look at the casualties. I couldn't find Australian numbers for the amount that were sick. But Australian had 1,204 killed in action, 2,267 wounded. U.S. casualties are 887 killed, 2,172 wounded, and a staggering 7,920 sick. So remember, a U.S. division at this time is slightly less than 15,000 men. So that division has taken 10,879 casualties. So it's going to be a while till that division is rebuilt and back in the war. Well, Japanese losses are estimated at 4,000 killed in battle and 3,000 from disease and starvation. But again, the key part here is the Japanese ability to try to take Port Moresby and New Guinea is now pretty much over. And from now on, the war will be fought to basically isolate the Japanese troops that are in New Guinea from being reinforced, so we will let the land kill them. And at this place, I want to talk just a little bit about the Australian Army. And I think that most people in the United States don't think much about the Australian Army. It's like, where were they? What did they do except North Africa? Well, they fought very, very hard for their country. And extremely important that they did. So eventually the last division comes back from Africa, and MacArthur now has a core strength, 3-division unit of Australian troops. And in New Guinea battles, these will be his most important infantry force. So they will fight all over, particularly fought well at Leh and Salamaua. And as the war goes on, they will continue to isolate the Japanese troops, and they will basically starve them out. Many more Japanese die from starvation and disease than they are ever killed by the Australians, believe me. But it's a disaster for the Japanese. Well,